At Christmas time the ghosts do love to walk abroad. In days long past, when the Yule log crackled in the hearth, and cast spindly leaping shadows into the dark corners of the room, those present, sated on ample portions of poultry, pudding, and port, would gather around to hear tales of the ghostly realm. To the accompaniment of a howling winter's wind outside in the gloom, the group would huddle close to enjoy a thrill of fear, knowing they were safe inside from the unknown without. Even as the door handle shook, even as the windows creaked. The telling of ghost stories at Christmas might be one of those traditions which has faded with the coming of electricity and state education, but still it lingers on like a stubborn revenant. A newspaper article once declared emphatically that young people were too modern for such Dickensian amusements anymore, in the year 1917. But here we are at Christmas 2021. Stories used to be told in Westmoreland of Jemmy Lowther, also known as Wicked Jimmy, and the bad Lord Lonsdale. This man, the first Earl of Lonsdale, lived from 1736 until 1802. At the age of 9 he succeeded to his grandfather's baronetcy, inheriting Lowther Hall and a slave plantation in Barbados. Although he married Mary, the daughter of the third Earl of Bute, he had a string of mistresses, one of whom, the daughter of one of his tenants, he must have truly adored. For when this young woman died, he did not have her removed for burial, but left her body in the bed until the stench of her rotting corpse became too much. Then what remained was placed in a glass-topped coffin and stored in a convenient cupboard. Eventually the woman's body was buried in Paddington Cemetery. He was said to terrorise the countryside, slaying and stealing as he went. Such an iniquitous individual could not be expected to stay quiet in death. His shade haunted the rooms and stables at Lowther Hall, until a local clergyman, reckoned to have great power over spirits, was called in to lay this menace. The spirit of Jemmy was condemned to be held down under a large rock called Wallow Crag. But for years afterwards, and especially at Christmas, the bad lord went dashing across the country in his coach and six. Many nights were heard the sound of his rattling carriage, and his curses at his phantom coachman to go ever faster, faster, through the midnight hours. Not 100 miles away from Lowther Hall was to be found the Cauld Lad of Hilton. He was a stable boy named Robert Skelton, who lived in the 16th or 17th century at Hilton Castle in Sunderland. The origin of his ghosthood has several variations, but all insist the young man was slain by Baron Hilton, possibly the 13th Baron, who was pardoned for an unspecified crime in 1609. The boy either overslept and failed to prepare a horse for the Baron, who was going on an important errand, or the Baron caught the stable boy frolicking with his daughter in the stable. It is said the Cauld Lad was dispatched with a scythe. His body was then secretly removed from the stable at night by the Baron, weighted down with stones and thrown into a pond. Every Christmas Eve the ghost of the murdered boy returned to the castle. If the kitchen was left untidy, he would helpfully tidy up, but if it was tidy, he would throw pewter vessels about the room and smash crockery. One night a cook stayed awake until midnight and discovered the cause of this disruption. He saw the ghost of a naked boy who remarked, "I'm cold." The cook left a green cloak and a hood beside the fire for the ghost that night, and the next morning it was gone. And never thereafter did the Cauld Lad cause chaos in the kitchen of Hilton Castle again. Instead, he contented himself to wander the corridors at night, singing to himself for many years. Another legend says that one night a scullery maid sneaked into the kitchen to taste the plum puddings, and was accosted by the Cauld Lad, who moaned, "Thee taste and thee taste, but thee never gie the Cauld Lad a taste." At Corby Castle in Cumbria, the haunting is done by the Radiant Boy, who on Christmas Day runs along the passageways and stands by the bedside of sleeping people. His origin is unknown, but Radiant Boys are a class of spirit of children who were murdered by their mothers. Corby is built on the site of an old Roman building, but most of this ghost's activity was reported from the 19th century. Kotachi Castle was haunted at night by the sound of a drum at Christmas. The drummer was said to have offended the Earl of Airlie, and was killed by being stuffed inside his drum and thrown from a high window. As some reports say the ghost was 9 feet tall, it must have been a squeeze. The drumming was said to portend a death in the family, but no drumming was heard in 1900 when the incumbent Earl died in the Boer War, and it is thought the haunting has ceased. Blickling Hall was the home of the Boleyn family. After Anne's messy divorce from Henry VIII at the blade of a French sword, her ghost returned home every Christmastide, driven down the avenue in a ghostly, hearse-like coach. Not only does the executed queen sit headless, her detached head resting in her lap, but the coachmen too are all headless, as are the 4 black horses which draw the carriage. Not only Anne, but her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, rides headless, with his cranium under his arm, in a coach driven by headless coachmen. As he died of natural causes with his head intact, this is somewhat surprising. Legend continues, however, saying that he must cross 40 bridges as a penance for his sins in life, lest he fall into the clutches of Satan. His penance will be complete at the end of 1,000 years. Another titled ghost was Lady Hamilton of Bolhoe, whose husband was a supporter of Mary Queen of Scots. The legend says when this queen too lost her head, the Hamiltons suffered for their loyalty to her. Their home at Woodhouseley and estates were confiscated by the first Earl of Moray, acting as regent for his nephew, the infant King James VI, and given to his friend Lord Justice Clerk Ballandine. Lady Hamilton, unaware of the situation, arrived home with her baby shortly before Christmas 1568. Ballandine arrived at Christmas to take possession of the property, and though the night was cold and snow thickly carpeted the ground, he threw Lady Hamilton and her infant child out into it. The next morning the woman was found in a state of madness, wandering the open fields, holding her dead child to her. Lady Hamilton herself died a few days later, but to this day her wraith, clutching that of her child, haunts the ruins of her old home, especially on Christmas night. On the 19th of January 1570, her sorrowing husband, either in revenge or for political motives, shot dead Regent Moray with a carbine in a street in Linlithgow, the first assassination of a head of state with a firearm. Hamilton eventually escaped to France. Arthur Lambsley wrote an article in 1934 predicting that at future Christmases, families would reunite by flying around the world in only 2 days. Or they could keep in contact through their universal telephone, his term for what became reality as the Internet. He also predicted electricity would transform the amusements of the day, especially for the young. Lambsley was also noted as a psychic investigator. An article appeared at Christmas 1930, in which he endeavoured to explain that ghosts were created through the belief of the person. At Christmas, somebody pining for a long-lost loved one could see them in their imagination so solidly they would seem to be tangible. The shared beliefs of people would amplify such an illusion into a thought form, which, though not the actual dead person returned from the grave, was a real entity created from the mind, which could be detected by sensitive instruments, so his theory goes. As examples, he cites the High Toby ghost. One Christmas he spent in an old-fashioned English village on the Downs. The locals were adamant that each year on Christmas Eve, the ghost of a highwayman haunted an old cottage. It was there more than 100 years before the gentleman of the road had met his sudden end, murdered on Christmas Eve. All the locals knew the story, and this folk memory kept the phantom appearing. At a second downland village, Lambsley heard an account of another Christmas ghost. This time it was of an old homeless man who was tramping the road on Christmas night. He came to a crossroads, and while trying to decide which path to take, was overcome by the cold, and slumped down dead at the roadside. Every Christmas night thereafter the ghost of the old man would appear at the crossroads, waving his arms at traffic, as if asking for help, or warning the motorists not to remain and share his frozen fate. At a small hamlet on the south coast of England during Yuletide, a phantom sailing ship was said to grace the waters if bad weather was coming. According to the elders of the village, it was the spectre of a sailing ship, which had been caught in a sudden squall many years before, and sunk, which now showed itself to warn the living, usually on moonlight nights. The belief was held so fervently that if a ghost ship was reported, the fishermen refused to put to sea for a few days. One year, possibly in the 1920s, the ship had appeared, and the men stayed ashore. They avoided the worst gales in memory which battered the English Channel with fearful ferocity. Further west, fishermen had gone to sea, and many ships and their crew were lost. Every Christmas at Bisham Abbey in London, it is said the ghost of Lady Hobby, who died in 1609, appears, washing her hands in a ghostly basin of water that moves before her as her spectre trudges from room to room, sobbing all the while, forever trying to cleanse the stain of innocent blood from her hands. The reason she returns is that she was a strict mother to her son, William, who, in spite of being constantly lectured about the quality of his schoolwork, either deliberately or accidentally blotted his copybooks with smudges of ink. Lady Hobby punished her son by beating him about the head with a heavy ruler. This day she hit him until he bled. Still angry, she tied him to his chair in the tower room and yelled at him to stay there until he finished his lesson properly, locking the door on the way out. Soon after, she received a summons to attend court by Queen Elizabeth. Delighted, she quickly packed up and left without telling anyone where William was. For several days she delighted in banquets and balls. Upon returning home she asked where William was, and the servants said they thought he was with her. Lady Hobby raced to the isolated room in the tower to find her son deceased. So the tale goes, but there is no record of a William Hobby, though the records may have been lost or covered up by Lady Hobby, who had influence and power. Alternatively, after the death of her first husband, she remarried and had a son called Francis, who did die young in unknown circumstances. Maybe the legend got the name wrong. Up north in Forfarshire, Scotland, is the extremely haunted Glams Castle. Accounts of the spectral wanderings of Earl Beardy, the monster of Glams, and others in the retinue of Bogles are too well known to repeat here. But one Christmas a lady staying at the castle as a guest prior to 1929 awoke to hear a soft body moving across the floor of her bedroom. There followed a crack like a bony joint, and the startled woman saw a luminous, horrid figure. She said, slowly the thing, whatever it was, took shape. A body, tawny and hunched, arms long and spidery, a large and terrible head covered with a tangled mass of grey hair, a face white and staring, pig-like in formation, malevolent in expression. As I stared at it aghast, it reared onto its haunches and leered hideously at me. Then shuffling forward it rolled over and lay sprawling out like some ungainly turtle. At this juncture the handle of the door turned, someone entered. There was a loud cry, and the whole tower, walls and rafters rang with the most appalling screams I have ever heard. Another haunted castle is Tamworth Castle, which has two ghosts who never fail to appear during Christmas. The White Lady walks along the terrace in shimmering robes which shine in the moonlight should Selene be traversing the sky, while the Black Lady haunts a staircase leading from the royal bedchamber to the tower. Newstead Abbey was another grand home assailed at Christmas by a galaxy of spirits, including the Goblin Friar, walking in the cloister and halls. This ghost is said to be a shapeless black mass with two glowing red eyes, which appeared to the Byron family as a harbinger of any unhappy events to befall them. The sixth Baron, the bad Lord Byron, famed as a poet and fighter for Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire, and father of Ada Lovelace, was one of those who claimed to have glimpsed this ghastly friar. The ghosts of his great-uncle, the fifth Lord Byron, and his sister Isabella Howard, have been seen riding on dark and stormy nights. William Byron was said to have organised satanic orgies at Newstead, and was rumoured to have murdered his wife and a coachman. In 1765 he was found guilty of the manslaughter of his cousin, William Chaworth, when the two men got drunk and argued over who had more game on their estate. In an ensuing duel, Byron ran his cousin through with his sword. His penalty was a small fine. At Huddington Court, Worcestershire, there is an avenue named Lady Winter's Walk. It was while here in 1606 that Gertrude Winter learned her husband Robert had been captured after 2 months on the run for his part in the gunpowder plot to assassinate King James I by blowing up the House of Lords in a bid to restore a Catholic monarch to England. Robert was quickly executed by being hanged, drawn and quartered, the English punishment at the time for treason. Hanged briefly and taken down still conscious, emasculated, disemboweled and the entrails burned, beheaded, and then chopped into 4 sections. This barbarous ritual continued to be used until 1820, although after 1660 men were dead from hanging before the dismemberment began. Little wonder poor Gertrude was so affected, and that her shade continues to walk the earth. Marischal College, Aberdeen, is haunted each Christmas by the victim of a fake execution, who walks the grounds of the school. A janitor named Downey had displeased the boys at the college by being a job's worth. On Christmas they decided to play a prank on him, pinioning the confused man, and while blindfolded, conducting a mock trial, where he was found guilty and ordered beheaded. Not aware of what was happening, Downey felt the flick of a wet towel on his neck, and apparently, under the belief he had been struck with a weapon, his heart gave out, and he died. At Four Oaks Hall, another ghostly lady has been seen walking about at Christmas. It was thought it may be the ghost of Elizabeth Pudsey, who lived around 1740, but whose date of death and burial place are a mystery. When the old building was demolished, a skeleton was found bricked up in the servants' quarters, which seemed to solve the puzzle of where Elizabeth went, and why she haunts her old home. Then it was discovered the skeleton belonged to a calf, which only compounded the mystery. No ghostly calf is reported there, but a ghost dog has been claimed to haunt Peel Castle on the Isle of Man. The Manx dog is a gruesome, misshapen hound, pure white, with gaping red jaws. It is said a soldier from the garrison stationed at the castle went to the gallery where it roamed to see the ghostly hound one Christmas. He returned from the experience a gibbering idiot, and died the next day, it is said. A building erected in the 1840s in Pambula, on New South Wales' Sapphire Coast, was the Retreat Restaurant in the 1980s. It was said to be haunted. A door with no lock, which normally opened freely, would sometimes be immovable, as if something was holding it shut from the other side. At Christmas 1984, Bruce Peters, who occasionally helped out, went upstairs to look for something. He felt a shadow behind him, but saw nobody there. And then he felt it again, and for a third time. It is thought the building is haunted by its original owner, Sims Covington, who was Charles Darwin's right-hand man on his Beagle voyage. Covington met a woman in Australia and was so smitten he emigrated from Britain to marry her, but after 5 children she deserted him for another man. Heartbroken, he died a few years later, aged 47, in 1861. Others working and dining here have felt a presence, and lights have flickered, and Sims Covington is blamed for it. Marwell Hall, near Winchester, is said to be haunted by a young woman wearing a wedding dress. It is said that long ago Lord Lovell married his bride on Christmas Eve. That night, during celebrations, a game of hide-and-seek was played. The new bride went off to hide, and did so well that nobody present could find her. For a whole week they searched, but in the end it was assumed she had changed her mind about marriage, and used the game as a ruse to flee the house. Many years later, in a seldom visited part of the house, used for storage, an ancient wooden chest was opened. Inside was found the mouldering remains of the bride. She had hidden in the old chest, but once inside, found it was soundproof, and the lid was either too heavy for her to raise from inside, or had latched from the outside. And there she remained, trapped as if buried alive. Only in death was her ghost able to escape the inadvertent coffin she had created for herself. In the late 1920s, a night watchman in East Barnet, London, reported that just before Christmas he had seen a figure in a long military cloak of the Middle Ages. The figure was nothing but a skeleton, but was identified as a Norman knight named Geoffrey de Mandeville, the first Earl of Essex. He was linked to the bony figure as he was said to have drowned in Camlet Moat nearby, where in the deepest part of the moat is an old chest full of gold and gems, fixed by iron chains to the bottom. In fact, de Mandeville died from an arrow wound received in 1144, during part of the civil wars against King Stephen, at Burwell Castle, in Cambridgeshire. Nevertheless, the local council believed the watchman had glimpsed something fearful, and had a report prepared to determine if extra wages should be paid to the watchman for work of an exceptionally disagreeable character. The Brown Lady of Raynham Hall is one of the most famous English ghosts, even said to have been photographed in 1936. In life, it is claimed she was Dorothy Walpole, who died of smallpox in 1726. One Christmas there was a large party at the hall, and when two of the guests, Colonel Loftus and his friend Mr. Hawkins, were going to bed, the latter said, "Who is that standing at your sister's door? How strangely she is dressed." As Loftus looked, the figure vanished, but a few nights later he was able to see her in the light of a full moon, dressed in a rich brown brocade, her features clearly defined, except for her eyes, which were the dark hollows of a skeleton's head. Some time after, a lady guest wrote that she hoped to glimpse the Brown Lady, but after 2 weeks she wrote that to her disgust she had witnessed nothing supernatural. 2 weeks went by, and she wrote that "I have just seen her. Whether there was any connection or not can never be known, but a little while later the woman died." Near Wycoller Hall, now in ruins, a spectral horseman named Cunliffe, in early 17th century garb, appears at Christmas, accompanied by wild, tempestuous weather, to revisit the spot where in life he murdered his wife. As the wind howls most fiercely, the noise of his galloping horse can be heard racing up the road and clattering over a small bridge before coming to a halt at the door to Wycoller Hall. Dismounting, the ghost runs up a great oaken staircase and enters one of the bedrooms. From inside the room issue screams, followed by moans, replaying the murder of so long ago. Then the phantom runs out, remounts his horse, and rides off back into the darkness, until the next haunted Christmas.